In the frozen valleys near Colville, Washington, where even the wind forgets to whisper, a reclusive war veteran lit a fire he thought would warm only himself. But as snow howled outside his forgotten outpost, two wild Mustang horses, one limping, the other barely breathing, stood silently at his broken fence and begged him with their eyes. Jesse Callahan hadn't spoken to another soul in months. That night, he would answer a cry that wasn't made with words, but with trust, fear, and a flicker of something divine. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Colville, Washington, was the kind of town that existed in whispers, hidden between the snow-draped ridges and towering pine forests of the Selkirk Mountains. By early December, it surrendered to the cold. The wind prowled through the evergreens like a restless ghost, and even the rivers fell silent, entombed beneath thick crusts of ice. Up past the timberline, nestled against a rock face scarred by time, stood an old game warden's cabin. It was small, patched with rusted tin, and forgotten by everyone but one man, Jesse Callahan. At 42, Jesse was built like the mountains he chose to disappear into, broad-shouldered, weather-worn, and solid. His face carried the same quiet strength, with deep lines tracing years of fatigue and fire. His hair, once coal-black, was streaked with premature gray, and his eyes, steel blue and distant, rarely made contact for long. After 15 years in the army, including a brutal deployment in the Hindu Kush, Jesse had chosen silence over society. Somewhere between the dust of Kandahar and the ashes of his old life, something in him had unraveled. He had once been a logistics specialist, kept things moving, kept men alive. But it was in the mountains of Afghanistan, in a forgotten forward operating base, that he bonded with a wiry brown stallion named Dusty, a military pack horse bred for endurance and trust. Dusty had been calm amid chaos, loyal beyond reason. When Jesse was ordered to abandon him during an airlift retreat, something inside him had snapped. He never forgave himself. That guilt, like the cold, seeped deep and stayed. His only companion now was Whiskey, a 10-year-old German wire-haired pointer. Whiskey was a large, grizzled dog with wiry brown and white fur and eyes that always seemed to know more than they should. He walked with a slight limp from an old accident involving a bear trap, but moved with quiet dignity. Loyal to a fault, Whiskey mirrored his master's solitude, rarely barking, never straying far, and always watching. On this particular evening, the storm rolled in hard from the northeast, hurling snow in thick diagonal bands. The outpost groaned in the wind. Inside, the wood stove popped and hissed as Jesse nursed a chipped mug of coffee, his legs stretched out toward the fire. Whiskey curled at his feet like a warm, breathing rug. The cabin was quiet, but for the occasional whistle of wind through the window seams. Jesse leaned back in his handmade rocker, absently rubbing the scar along his left wrist, the one Dusty had given him during a wild spook, back when they were learning each other's rhythms. Funny, he thought. Pain didn't fade, it just got quieter. Then it came, a sound not belonging to the wind. At first, he thought it was the creak of a shutter or the groan of the frost against the roof. But it came again, high, broken, fragile. A whinny. Jesse froze. He glanced at Whiskey, whose ears were already perked, head tilted toward the door. The dog rose slowly, tail stiff. Jesse stood, reaching for his heavy wool coat hung beside the stove. He pulled on gloves with fingers still stiff from an old wrist fracture and took the lantern from its hook. "Stay here," he muttered to Whiskey, though they both knew the dog wouldn't. The storm slapped his face the moment the door creaked open. Snow stung his cheeks like grit. He lowered the lantern and stepped into the dark, his boots crunching through knee-deep powder. The wind howled down from the peaks like a wild animal, and then in the halo of the lantern's trembling light, he saw them. Two shapes near the far fence, barely standing. One large, the other half its size. Coated in frost, they looked like ghosts made of breath and bone. The larger one, clearly the mother, stood hunched, flanks heaving, her once proud mane plastered to her neck in frozen strands. The smaller horse, a yearling, leaned into her side, legs trembling violently. Jesse's breath caught in his throat. They didn't run. They didn't move at all. Their eyes met his, wide, unblinking, pleading, not with fear, but with hope. He stepped closer, slowly, deliberately. The fence creaked beneath his gloves as he leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. "What in God's name are you two doing out here?" The mare blinked, shifting her weight to shield the colt. The younger horse let out another soft, stank, broken cry, its voice nearly drowned by the wind. Jesse's instinct screamed at him to turn back. Wild horses don't come to humans, they don't beg. This wasn't natural. But neither was watching something die when you could stop it. His gaze scanned the pen, unused for years, its lean-to collapsed but still offering partial shelter. Inside, there were remnants of old hay, enough to make a bed. He turned and trudged back to the cabin, Whiskey following closely, eyes flicking between Jesse and the horses. Back inside, he moved with purpose. An old tarp, 3 thick wool blankets, a dented thermos of warm water, and a half bale of hay he'd forgotten he had, all piled onto a canvas sled. He muttered as he worked, half to himself, half to the ghosts of old regrets. 15 minutes later, he returned to the pen. The horses hadn't moved. The mare watched him with wary stillness, ears twitching but body unmoving. Jesse climbed over the fence, staying low, voice soft. "All right, Mama, I'm not here to hurt you." He spread the tarp beneath the lean-to and layered hay and blankets, working in silence. He poured the water into a shallow pan and set it nearby. When he turned, the mare was still watching, but she had taken one slow step forward. And behind her, the yearling collapsed. Jesse froze, but the mother didn't bolt. Instead, she stepped to the colt, nuzzled its neck, then turned to Jesse with a snort, not a warning, but something almost seeking. He knelt beside the colt, whose ribs stood sharp beneath its soaked coat. Male, barely weaned from full dependence. A narrow white blaze ran down his face like a bolt of lightning. His left hind leg trembled in sharp spasms. "No blood," Jesse murmured. "Just cold, cramped, maybe a sprain." He reached out slowly. The colt flinched but didn't pull away. Jesse laid one gloved hand on his flank. "Easy, little man." He wrapped a blanket around the trembling frame, then turned to the mare. She stood close, her breath fogging around him, but she didn't step back. She understood. And in her eyes, Jesse saw Dusty, not the body, not the color, but the soul. The storm had not let up. If anything, it had grown teeth. It shrieked across the ridgeline and slammed into Jesse's cabin with such force that the old tin roof rattled like an angry warning. Snow curled through the pines in pale, hissing curtains. The world beyond the fence had vanished, erased by white. And yet, inside the ramshackle pen behind the cabin, something ancient and raw was unfolding. The quiet collision of wild instinct and fragile trust. Jesse stood just inside the fence, hands burning with cold, the damp scent of horse sweat and frozen earth in his lungs. The mare, he had taken to calling her Luna for the pale crescent of white on her forehead, still watched him with caution, but she hadn't moved to stop him. She stood like a battered sentinel over the colt. Her coat was a soft gray dapple, though now heavy with frost and clumped snow. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, flicked between Jesse and her foal with the wary calculation of a creature who had only ever known survival. The colt, Jesse hadn't named him yet, lay on a spread of hay beneath the tattered lean-to, the blanket still clinging to his body. His breaths came in uneven puffs, and though he had stopped shivering, his limbs remained too stiff for comfort. Jesse crouched beside him and removed his gloves, wincing at the contact of ice-bitten skin on matted fur. He checked the swelling at the colt's hind leg again, still inflamed, but there was no displacement, no break, just a trauma that needed time and warmth to heal. He'd seen worse in men and horses. Behind him, Whiskey padded through the snow, his gait uneven but steady. The old dog paused just inside the pen and gave a low chuff of disapproval, then lay down near the gate, paws crossed, eyes alert. His role, as always, was clear, the quiet watcher. Jesse caught his gaze for a second and offered a faint nod. Inside Jesse's chest, something coiled and uncoiled. This was dangerous. These weren't pets. They were Mustangs, feral, unpredictable, sacred to the land, and often bound by rules older than fences and flags. Technically, helping them was frowned upon. Legally, he could get into real trouble. There were rangers who tracked these herds, wildlife officers who could issue fines or worse. And yet, he remembered the blistering heat of Afghanistan, the weight of Dusty's saddle beneath his palms, the way the horse had turned toward him during their final moments together, ears tilted back, not in fear, but in betrayal. He wouldn't repeat that mistake. He stood and turned toward the back shed, what had once been a livestock stall when the cabin served as a ranger station decades ago. Most of its beams had warped from years of snow, and part of the roof sagged inward. But the back corner still offered shelter from the wind, and it had a sloped floor Jesse could sweep clean. He fetched a shovel and a pitchfork and got to work. It took the better part of an hour to clear the space. He laid down fresh straw from a forgotten bale, spread 2 more blankets in a nest, and stacked firewood nearby in case he had to build a small heat source close by. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than the open field. When he returned to the pen, Luna snorted softly and shifted aside as he approached. He moved slowly, carefully, and lifted the colt in his arms. The weight surprised him, not heavy but awkward. The colt struggled weakly, panic flaring in his eyes. Jesse held him tighter. "Easy, kid, I've got you." To his surprise, Luna followed, not aggressively, not with anger, but with worry. As he crossed the yard, the mare trotted close behind, hooves crunching against the frozen dirt, head low. Whiskey rose and stepped to the side, tail down but not afraid. He watched Luna pass with a kind of stoic curiosity, then took up position beside the shed like a sentry. Inside the stall, Jesse laid the colt down gently and adjusted the blankets. He then stepped back to allow Luna space. She hesitated at the doorway, sniffed, snorted, tested the ground. Then, like a mother checking the corners of a nursery, she stepped in, circled her foal once, and finally settled down beside him. Only then did Jesse allow himself to breathe. Back in the cabin, he stoked the fire and peeled off his soaked outer layer. His hands throbbed from the cold and the weight of decision. He poured himself coffee and sat near the stove, staring into the flame, jaw clenched. That's when the memory came again, unbidden, sharp. Corporal Danny Travis, 19, from Georgia, the greenest kid on the convoy and always smiling. Jesse had found him after the ambush, curled beside Dusty's saddle, trying to stop the bleeding from his leg with a field bandage soaked in his own blood. Dusty had stood over him the whole time. Jesse had saved Danny, got him on a chopper, but Dusty had been left behind. He took a long sip, letting the heat crawl down his throat. Suddenly, a knock. 3 sharp raps on the door. Jesse stiffened. No one should have been out here. He reached for the hunting knife he kept near the hearth and moved to the window. Through the swirling snow, a figure emerged, wrapped in layers of olive and tan, a parka with a fur-lined hood pulled tight. She held a flashlight, now lowered, and her boots were half buried in fresh drifts. He cracked the door open an inch. "Can I help you?" he asked sharply. The woman stepped forward, lifting her chin. Her voice was clear, but tinged with urgency. "Name's Marin Delaney. I'm with the Washington Wild Equine Network, WEIN. I tracked 2 lost Mustangs this way. Got reports they might have crossed near Twin Butte Pass before the storm. I saw tracks, and your fence." Jesse's eyes narrowed. Marin was tall, lean, and moved with the efficient grace of someone used to working in nature. Her parka was worn but well kept, her eyes hazel with flecks of amber, focused and unblinking. She looked like she hadn't slept in 2 days. "You with the government?" "No," she said quickly. "Private conservation. We help with herd tracking, rescues when needed. May I?" She gestured to the door. Jesse hesitated, then opened it enough to let her step inside. The warmth hit her like a wave, and she blinked rapidly as her goggles fogged. 2 Mustangs, a gray mare and a yearling colt, she said, pulling down her hood. The colt was reported injured. We thought they wouldn't survive this storm, but we've been wrong before. Jesse said nothing. Finally, he sighed and poured a second cup of coffee. "They're in my shed, colt's legs swollen, mare's holding together but barely." Marin's shoulders eased a bit. "You brought them in?" she said, almost in disbelief. "I couldn't leave them to die." She looked at him, long and quiet, and then, unexpectedly, smiled. "Then we have a chance." The air inside the old livestock stall was thick with the mingled scent of straw, sweat, and wet fur. Outside, the storm still raged, but within the shed's slanted beams and rust-flaked nails, a pocket of tenuous peace held. Jesse moved slowly, kneeling beside the injured colt who lay half-curled on the makeshift bedding. The horse's flanks trembled despite the layers of blankets, and his breath came in fast, shallow bursts. Luna, the gray mare, stood as close as the walls would allow, her broad body angled between her foal and the open entrance, ears swiveling at every creak of wind or Jesse's slightest shift. Jesse had known pain, pain in the bone, pain in the heart, pain that lingered behind the eyes even when sleep came. But watching this colt struggle to stay awake, to stay warm, was a different kind of ache. A helpless ache. He unzipped the weather-stained first aid pouch he kept for whiskey and carefully pulled out a small tub of antiseptic, a roll of gauze, and the last of the pain-relieving salve he'd bartered for from a rancher in Omak the previous fall. He hadn't intended to use it on anything but his old dog's arthritic limbs. But this was different. Gently, Jesse touched the swollen hind leg just above the hock. The colt let out a thin, wheezing nicker and tried to kick weakly, but Jesse held firm, speaking low in the calm rhythm that horses seem to understand better than words. "It's all right, buddy. I've got you." The joint was warm, too warm, and Jesse guessed the injury had been festering since before the storm hit. He rubbed a layer of salve into the skin, wincing as the colt flinched, then wrapped the joint in a layer of gauze and secured it with strips of duct tape. It wasn't elegant, but it was tight and would keep the cold out. The joint supported. When he finished, he stepped back, rubbing warmth into his own stiff hands. Luna dipped her head toward the colt and nudged the bandage. She didn't panic. Instead, she let out a soft wuffle and slowly lowered her body to lie beside him, tucking her legs under and curling her frame around his like a sheltering tree. Jesse blinked hard. The snow on her back was beginning to melt in the heat of their shared breath. He stood and turned toward the shed entrance where Whiskey was lying just beyond the doorway. The old dog, 15 years and gray in the muzzle, lifted his head, ears tilted forward. Whiskey had been with Jesse through 6 deployments, across deserts, jungles, and frozen mountains, and had a calm soul that never startled, even in gunfire. Now he watched these wild horses with a kind of ancestral wisdom, sensing, perhaps, that they too had seen war. As Jesse stepped out into the open, the bitter air slapped his face. He made his way back to the cabin, boots crunching over crusted drifts. The sun was long gone, though its glow remained faintly in the clouds, casting everything in pale blue hues. The door creaked open under his hand, the hinges groaning like a tired man. Inside, Marin Delaney sat at the small table, stripped down to a red flannel undershirt. Her parka hung near the stove to dry. She had short, dark brown hair, cut practical and close, and a sharp jawline softened only by the fine creases near her eyes, the kind born of years squinting into sun and snow. Her skin was weather-touched, and her eyes were a quiet hazel, alert and pragmatic. She didn't smile when Jesse entered, but she gave a small nod. "How's the leg?" "Warmed, wrapped, and prayed over," he said, setting the empty first aid pouch down. "He's a fighter, but that leg's in a bad way. Infection hasn't set in yet, but it's close." Marin's lips thinned. "We've got a mobile med kit back at our staging point near Rattlesnake Gulch, 30 miles west, but the pass is blocked with snow. We tried to bring the truck through 3 days ago and ended up buried to the wheel wells." She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded topo map, spreading it across the table. "There's a chance we could send someone on snowmobile, but the machine we've got is under repair. Battery's dead and the tracks are stripped." Jesse studied the map, tracing the route with a gloved finger. "I've got an old ski-doo in the tool shed, named her Rosaline. She's half busted and smokes like a devil, but she runs. We could try." Marin looked at him for a long moment. "You'd do that? Help get them out?" Jesse nodded slowly. "They came here for a reason. I don't intend to leave them stranded." A silence stretched between them. Then, quietly, Marin said, "You've done more than most already. Some folks out here wouldn't think twice about leaving them to the snow." Jesse didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the hearth and added another log to the stove. As the flames leapt higher, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls, his mind drifted. He saw Dusty again. The final night in Kandahar, the horse had been limping, spooked by mortar fire, flank grazed by shrapnel. Jesse had tried to soothe him, tie him to the convoy trailer. But the order had come. Leave everything that couldn't fit. A new unit was inbound, and the route had to be cleared. Dusty had looked back at him, just once, as the truck pulled away. It was a look Jesse had never forgiven. Back in the cabin, he sat down across from Marin and stared at the fire. "I left one behind once, swore I'd never do it again." Marin folded her arms and leaned back in the chair. "Then we're in agreement." Whiskey let out a groaning yawn from the rug and rolled to his side. The next few hours passed in preparation. Jesse checked the snowmobile's fuel lines, replaced the battery from a backup generator, and patched the torn runner with epoxy strips. Marin reorganized the first aid gear, bundled extra blankets, and radioed in coordinates to a colleague named Eric Townsend, a voice on the other end who promised to meet them halfway with a trailer if they made it through the canyon pass. Eric, from Marin's description, was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with a thick Maine accent and a laugh like gravel. A former Forest Service ranger, now a field medic for the WEN team. Gruff but gentle, and capable of rigging a shelter from nothing but bark and tarps. Night had truly settled when Jesse and Marin stepped outside to check the horses one last time. The sky was clear now, and the stars burned sharp above the trees. Inside the stall, Luna raised her head as they approached but didn't rise. The colt slept against her flank, breathing easier now. Marin knelt by the entrance, watching them quietly. "They've got a bond," she murmured. "Not just blood. The kind of bond that keeps you going when everything else fails." Jesse didn't speak. He didn't need to. The morning after the storm settled over the mountains, the sky remained overcast but calmer, casting a dull silver light over the snow-blanketed forest that surrounded Jesse Callahan's lonely cabin. The cold lingered like a second skin, pressing into every crevice of the structure and wrapping itself around Jesse's bones as he stepped out onto the frozen porch. A thermos of lukewarm coffee in one gloved hand. Whiskey, his faithful old coonhound with a black and tan coat now flecked with gray, padded out beside him, nose twitching at the air. Jesse was about to check on the horses again when he noticed something that didn't belong. Human footprints, circling the old livestock pen. He stopped mid-step, his military instincts kicking in. The tracks were fresh, no more than a couple of hours old, slightly pressed and straight-lined like someone with purpose. Whiskey growled low in his throat and moved to sniff the edge of one print. Jesse scanned the tree line. A stranger this far out was either in trouble, had trouble to bring, or maybe, just maybe, was connected to the 2 wild Mustangs in his care. Grabbing his coat and rifle, Jesse followed the trail through the woods, moving carefully along the ridge. Whiskey trotted ahead, occasionally glancing back to ensure Jesse was keeping pace. The prints led into a stretch of thin pines and wound toward a clearing near an abandoned ranger watchpoint. There, half-kneeling behind a snow-swept boulder, was a woman. She stood up as Jesse approached, slowly and deliberately, her gloved hands raised halfway in peace. She was tall, around 5'9", dressed in a brown field coat with reflective strips and a fur-lined hood that framed a face weathered more by experience than age. Her hair was a mess of wind-blown black curls tucked into a knit cap, and her eyes were the color of stormy dusk, sharp, unwavering, and observant. "I'm not trespassing," she said calmly, her voice low, deliberate, with a faint rasp. "My name's Dr. Marin Skye. I'm a field veterinarian with the Northern Mustang Preservation Alliance." Jesse didn't lower the rifle, but his grip eased. "You're a long way from the highway. What are you tracking?" She lowered her hands slowly. "2 Mustangs, a mare and a yearling. They went missing after last week's storm. We lost their signal near Birch Ridge. I spotted them yesterday, recognized the smaller one's limp. They were near your place." She paused. "I came to confirm." Whiskey sniffed cautiously at her boots, but didn't growl, which was something. Jesse exhaled and nodded toward the cabin. "Let's talk inside." Back at the outpost, Marin took a seat at the kitchen table, removing her gloves and warming her fingers near the stove. Jesse poured her a mug of thick, bitter coffee. Boone circled once and lay down near Whiskey, who remained seated between Jesse and the visitor like a silent guard. "They're out back," Jesse said. "Found them near Collapse. I gave them hay, some shelter. Yearling's got a bad leg, bandaged it best I could." Marin's face softened at that. "You did more than most would, especially in a place like this." She sipped the coffee, clearly used to its bitterness. "We've been following a small herd of 7 for months. They travel between here and the canyon basin to the east. After the blizzard, 5 regrouped near Coldwater Bend. The other 2, your pair, vanished." Jesse studied her face. She looked like someone who'd spent most of her life outdoors, sun-kissed skin, a faint scar over her brow, eyes always watching. "How long you been with the group?" 6 years stateside. Before that, 2 years in Kenya. We worked with injured lions, rehab and rewild projects. Nothing prepares you for earning a wild animal's trust, she said, her smile wry. But I've seen it save more than just animals. Her words lingered in Jesse's mind. He thought of Dusty, the mountain patrol horse he'd grown close to in Afghanistan, how Dusty had taken a bullet meant for him, how Jesse had been forced to leave him behind when the medevac chopper came. That day had carved a quiet wound into his soul. Seeing the young Mustangs stumble in the snow had reopened it. I ain't trying to keep them, he said finally, just trying to keep them alive. That's all I need to hear, Marin replied, standing. Mind if I take a look? Together, they stepped out into the clearing behind the cabin. The pen looked makeshift but sturdy enough. The adult mare stood protectively near the lean-to, flanks dusted in snow, eyes alert but not fearful. The yearling lay curled on a bed of straw, its hind legs still stiff but its breathing steady. Marin approached slowly, crouching at the edge of the pen, whispering softly under her breath. The mare watched but didn't move, as though she sensed this stranger bore no threat. Marin placed her gloved hand on the top rail and gently reached for the young horse's leg. Swelling's down slightly, she murmured. No open wound, could be a sprain or a stress fracture. She pulled a small flashlight from her coat and checked the eye reflexes, then the heartbeat. Still fighting, strong pulse. Jesse watched, arms crossed, his breath fogging in the air. What happens next? I can radio my team. They're camped about 10 miles out near an old creek bed. If we can transport the horses safely, we'll get them medical care, keep them together, then reintroduce them to the herd, assuming we find the others again. Jesse hesitated. Letting go wasn't easy. They trust me, might not trust anyone else. Marin turned to face him. Then maybe you come with them, help ease the transition. It was an unexpected offer, and for a moment, Jesse didn't know how to respond. Behind him, Whiskey wagged his tail once and sat beside the fence like a sentinel waiting for the next command. Inside the pen, the mare shifted forward, placing her nose briefly against Jesse's jacket. He stood frozen, stunned by the gesture. Marin said nothing, just watched with a look of understanding. Let's call your team, Jesse said finally. We'll figure out the rest later. The storm had pulled back just enough to reveal a brittle sun over the craggy ridgelines near Colville. The snow hadn't softened, it had simply paused, as if daring Jesse Callahan and Dr. Marin Skye to step into the teeth of what came next. They stood just beyond the pen, wind gusting through the pines, the Mustang mare snorting softly beside her injured foal. 5 miles stood between the cabin and the designated recovery post where Marin's team awaited with medical gear, shelter, and transport crates. 5 miles of steep trails, fallen branches, ice-choked stream beds, and narrow canyon paths. For an able-bodied man, the hike alone would be exhausting. For a wounded yearling dragged by sled through mountainous terrain in midwinter, it bordered on lunacy. But Jesse had done more with less, and with worse odds. I'll prep Bones, he said, turning to his old snow machine parked beneath a tarp near the woodshed. Its red paint was dulled by rust, and duct tape held the rear taillight in place. Bones had been a gift from a trapper named Ray McKinley, a lanky one-eyed veteran who swore the machine still had 1 or 2 last rides in her. I'll harness the sled, Marin nodded, wrapping her scarf tighter. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her field training obvious, hands steady, feet firm, no unnecessary movements. Together, they lashed the wooden sled with old horse blankets and thick hemp ropes. Jesse fetched a couple of fleece pads from his survival gear, while Marin carefully led the injured foal, who she'd now started calling Ash because of the smoky dapples on his coat, onto the sled. Ash whinnied once but settled, likely too exhausted to resist. The mother mare refused to be led. She wouldn't wear a halter, wouldn't accept a rope, and Jesse didn't try. He simply left the gate open. As the snow machine coughed to life and the sled lurched forward, the mare followed, trotting steadily behind, ears pricked, eyes locked on her child. Jesse was no stranger to cold, but the wind in the canyon was a different kind of cruel. It howled like a wild beast, curling through the cliffs and ravines. The trail narrowed fast, weaving through pine groves and frozen creeks. Bones sputtered once, then again, and Jesse muttered threats beneath his breath. His hands, wrapped in fleece-lined gloves, gripped the handlebars like lifelines. They traveled single file, the snowmobile at the front, the sled trailing on a knotted tow line, Maren hiking just beside it, checking Ash's position every few hundred yards. Behind, the mare never strayed. They reached the halfway point at an old firewatch outpost now buried in snow. Jesse called a break. Ash was shaking, his body chilled despite the layers. Maren removed one of her own coats to add warmth over him. From the tree line came a low, warning bark. Whiskey, who'd flanked them all the while, had paused ahead and was growling into the woods. Maren immediately went still, eyes narrowing. Jesse walked forward, pulling the rifle from the sled holster. From behind a stand of birch, a figure emerged, young, maybe 15. A teenage boy in a faded blue parka, hood lined with faux fur, his jeans soaked up to the knees. His cheeks were raw from the cold, and his eyes darted nervously from Jesse's weapon to the Mustangs. "I didn't mean nothing," the boy said quickly. "I saw y'all coming through the canyon. I was up on the ridge hunting rabbits." Jesse lowered the barrel, but didn't relax. "You're a bit young to be hunting alone. What's your name?" "Dawson. Dawson Kincaid." He rubbed his gloved hands together. "I live down by Bear Hollow. Cabin with the blue shutters. Ain't no one there but me and my brother. He's sick." Maren stepped forward, her tone gentler. "What are you doing out here?" "Trying to find food," Dawson said, voice dropping. "Don't want to end up like the foxes. Ma used to say the woods give what you need, but they take double if you ain't careful." He glanced at the sled, eyes lingering on Ash. "That Colt yours?" Jesse looked at him a moment longer, then nodded. Maren dug into her pack and pulled out 2 energy bars and a packet of jerky, handing them over without a word. Dawson accepted the food like it weighed gold. "You can walk with us to the post if you want," Jesse offered gruffly. "They've got heat, medical stuff, maybe something for your brother." The boy's eyes widened, but he nodded, then fell into step beside Maren. As they trekked deeper, the canyon grew narrower, the sun now low in the sky and shadows long and pale. The wind picked up again, slicing through their coats. The snowmobile's engine sputtered for a third time, then coughed into silence. "Fuel line's freezing," Jesse muttered. "We walk from here." They rearranged the harness, attaching ropes to Jesse's waist and shoulders. Maren took the rear. They pulled together, the sled dragging slowly through the powder. The mare, undeterred, kept her pace, her eyes fierce with the silent resolve of motherhood. By the time the outline of the ranger station came into view, a squat wooden structure with a plume of smoke rising from the chimney, Jesse's legs were numb and his arms ached. But inside that ache was something sharper, purpose. That aching sense of uselessness he'd lived with since Afghanistan had thawed, just a little. The door of the post swung open, revealing a man in a green field jacket, heavyset, with thick glasses and a wool cap. He waved them in. "We were about to send out a search party." "You made it." They brought Ash inside first, then the mare, who followed without a fight. Dawson was ushered into a cot beside the stove and handed hot cocoa by a volunteer nurse named Sherry, a red-haired woman in her late 50s who smelled faintly of lavender and wood smoke. She reminded Jesse of someone, but the memory wouldn't come. Ash was examined and stabilized, the swelling now reduced thanks to the consistent care. The mare refused to leave his side. Jesse stood quietly by, watching Maren move through the room with confidence, issuing orders, checking vitals. She looked over at him once, a smile flickering at the corner of her mouth. "You've done good, Jesse," she said simply. He looked back at her, then to the horse curled in straw, and finally to the boy in the corner sipping cocoa with both hands. "I didn't do it alone," he said. The weather had turned violent again. Sleet lashed sideways, pushed by a wind that screamed down the mountain pass like a creature unchained. With bones sputtering and threatening to die completely, Jesse Callahan made the call. He veered off the trail and found a rocky crevice, a hollow shaped like a half-moon in the granite cliffside, partially shielded by leaning pines and high enough to avoid the rising snowdrifts. They would camp here, or they would not make it at all. He brought the snowmobile to a crawl and waved for Maren to follow. She nodded, pulling her hood tighter and guiding the sled, where Ash lay drowsy but alive. The mare stayed right behind, her flanks now flecked with ice, her breath coming in great foggy huffs. They cleared the rocks quickly, working together without speaking. Years of field experience in different worlds, Jesse's from war zones, Marin's from animal sanctuaries, taught them how to move in rhythm. Jesse gathered kindling from beneath the trees and dug a shallow fire pit. Marin unpacked emergency foil blankets and spread them across the flatter ground for Ash and his mother. Whiskey, already damp and shaking, flopped down at Jesse's side once the fire cracked to life. The dog's gray muzzle twitched at the scent of smoke. His eyes, though milky with age, remained alert to every gust of wind. He didn't whimper or bark. He simply lay watchful, as if guarding not just Jesse, but the fragile thread holding this wild family together. Jesse removed his outer jacket and draped it over Ash. Marin followed suit with one of the thermal blankets. She crouched beside the foal, murmuring quietly, stroking behind his ears. Then she turned to the mare, speaking softer still, as if to some ancient deity rather than an animal. "You've carried more than just weight," she whispered. "You carried faith." Jesse had seen many things in the mountains: elk driven mad by frostbite, men frozen upright beside their rifles. But nothing struck him quite like the way this Mustang mare lowered her head then, stretching out her neck until her muzzle gently touched his shoulder. It was not fear. It was not dominance. It was gratitude, clean and wordless. He reached up, brushing snow off her mane. "You're a good mother," he said, half to himself. The mare exhaled through her nostrils, a warm plume clouding the air between them, then turned and nestled beside her colt. Later, as darkness swallowed the last of the trail behind them and the fire danced low, Jesse sat at the edge of the flames, sharpening a stick absently with his knife. Marin sat cross-legged nearby, sipping from a metal flask of peppermint tea she'd brewed from the emergency rations. "You ever get nights like this in Afghanistan?" she asked. Jesse gave a slow nod. "Plenty. Cold was different there, though. Drier, cleaner, like it burned the air." He hesitated, then looked at her. The firelight painted her face in flickers, her high cheekbones, strong jaw, and dark eyes that had seen so much but still held light. Her thick brown hair was twisted into a braid, now dusted with snow. Her scarf, patterned with faded maroon and gold, looked almost ceremonial. "Used to ride out with the logistics crews," he said. "Supply drops to the ridgeline posts. Horses were the only way through. I bonded with one named Dusty. Light gray like morning fog, smart, stubborn, got me out of a bad spot once." "What happened to him?" Jesse looked into the fire. "Caught shrapnel during a night op. No way to medevac a horse. I had to leave him behind." He looked at me, same way this mare did tonight. He paused, fingers tightening around the stick. "Never forgave myself for it." Marin didn't interrupt. She just nodded, letting the silence stretch between them like a bridge, not a barrier. "My dad," Jesse continued after a while, "used to say something. Back when I was little, before the army, he'd take me out on the ranch and make me watch over the calves during birthing season. I asked him once why we had to stay up all night for animals. He smiled faintly. He said, 'Son, not everyone's born to be a hero. But the one who stands watch for the weak, that's the kind of man the world needs more of.'" Marin leaned back against her pack, pulling her coat tighter. "Your dad sounds like the kind of man I wish I'd met." "He was complicated," Jesse said, glancing toward Whiskey. "But he believed in doing right, even if no one saw it." The storm didn't let up. Snow fell in waves, hissing as it touched the fire, but the cave held firm, and the fire endured. Jesse pulled out a small, battered harmonica from his coat and began to play. The notes were soft, uneven, but warm. A lullaby for the broken. Whiskey lifted his head, ears twitching. Ash let out a tired snort. The mare remained still, eyes half-lidded, chest rising and falling slowly in rhythm with the tune. When Jesse finished, he looked up. Marin's eyes were closed, her head leaned back, a small smile on her lips. "Didn't know you played," she said without opening them. "Didn't know I remembered how," he replied. They sat like that, breathing in the warmth and quiet as the storm howled on. And in that wild silence, two strangers bound by instinct and duty, surrounded by creatures born of the wild, found something like peace. Morning came in a hushed whisper, as if even the wind had tired itself out during the night. Snow no longer hurled itself against the cliff face but drifted gently, thin and sparkling in the pale gold light of dawn. The sky above the ridge glowed a weak blue, shy and uncertain. Jesse Callahan was already awake, sipping weak coffee from a tin mug as he watched the mare in her full slumber in the patch of heat left by the dwindling fire. Whiskey, curled into a tight ball of gray and tan fur, snored softly beside the sled. Marin stirred not long after, hair slightly tousled, her breath fogging in the air as she exhaled into her hands to warm them. She didn't speak. They didn't need to. The bond forged in last night's storm had given them a rhythm, one of silence, respect, and quiet understanding. "I'll go gather more wood," Jesse said, standing and stretching the stiffness out of his legs. "Looks like we've got a calm window before the next front." "Be careful," Marin murmured, reaching for her gloves. "No telling what's out there this far up." Jesse nodded, grabbing his axe and striding into the trees that ringed the rocky cove. The snow was softer now, giving underfoot with a satisfying crunch. It smelled clean, untouched, the kind of air that reminded him of childhood before the noise of war or heartbreak ever settled in his bones. As he stepped over a fallen pine, he saw something that made him stop mid-stride. Hoofprints. Fresh. The kind of crisp indentation that couldn't have come from the mare or Ash, not in this direction. The gait was uneven, staggered. Jesse knelt, brushing aside snow to get a better look. "Another horse?" he whispered to himself, heart ticking a little faster. The tracks veered off the trail and climbed toward a bluff, cloaked in bare spruce trees and shadows. Jesse hesitated for only a breath, then followed. It wasn't far. Just over a small rise, nestled beside a half-frozen stream, stood a creature that looked more ghost than horse. A young Mustang, starved nearly to bone, with a ragged chestnut coat that hung in clumps. Its ribs stood out like harp strings, and its legs trembled under its own weight. Its eyes, huge and dark, blinked with exhaustion rather than fear. Jesse lowered his axe. "Well, buddy," he said gently, voice barely above the wind. "You're a long way from home." The Mustang didn't bolt. It took a step forward, then another, hooves crunching softly in the ice. When Jesse extended his hand, the animal stopped, head swaying slightly. A scar ran across its left shoulder, an old injury, half-healed. A survivor. Jesse recognized the look. "Let's get you warm," he whispered. Back at the camp, Marin looked up from tending Ash and froze as she spotted the new arrival. Her eyes widened. "You found another?" "More like he found me," Jesse replied. "Can you help me stabilize him? He's close to collapse." She was already moving. Together they unpacked emergency feed, warm wraps, and water. As Marin crouched beside the emaciated Mustang, brushing away frost from its side, the mare gave a sharp, alert snort. She rose to her feet, nostrils flared, ears pricked. Ash stumbled forward behind her, tail twitching. Then something extraordinary happened. The mare stepped forward slowly, then faster, until she was nose to nose with the new Mustang. There was no bray of warning, no stomp of hooves. She nuzzled him gently, mournfully, as if recognizing something long lost. Ash followed, pressing his head against the older colt's flank. Marin's breath caught. They know him. Jesse stood still, watching the scene unfold like some myth woven in real time. The three Mustangs, mother, foal, and the skeletal survivor, circled each other, brushing heads, bumping flanks. No words were spoken, yet something primal and sacred passed between them. "This is their herd," Jesse said, voice hoarse. "The storm must have scattered them," Marin replied, her tone reverent. "This one, he must have been the brother." Just then, from the ridge above, two snowmobiles hummed faintly, growing louder. Jesse turned, squinting into the light. Moments later, two figures dismounted and trudged toward the camp. One was tall and lean, with sandy hair sticking out beneath a black wool beanie. The other, older, stockier, had a grizzled beard and a voice like gravel when he spoke. "You folks all right?" the older man asked, slinging his rifle behind his back. "Heard your emergency ping? Took us a while to get around the north ridge." Marin stood and stepped forward. "Bo, you made it." Bo Hargreaves, leader of the Mustang Wildlife Relief Unit, was in his early 60s, with sharp eyes and slow, deliberate movements that made animals trust him. He looked from Jesse to the reunited horses and let out a long whistle. "I'll be damned," he said. "You found them all." The younger man beside him nodded. "They were on our list of missing. That chestnut, his name's Flint. Tough colt. Been out here since the blizzard hit." Jesse looked at Flint, who now stood between his family, still shaking, but no longer alone. "He held on," Jesse said softly. "Like all of us. Whiskey barked once and wagged his tail, trotting toward Bo for a sniff before returning to Jesse's side, satisfied. "Let's get these horses back to base," Bo said. "We've got med tents and warm stalls waiting." As the group worked together to secure the sleds and prepare for the descent, Jesse caught Marin watching him. She didn't say anything, just smiled, a small, tired, genuine smile. And in that smile, he saw the warmth of firelight, the patience of storms weathered together, and something that might last longer than winter. The sky above the forested outskirts of Colville had softened into a pale, wistful gray, casting long shadows across the snow-cloaked clearing. The storm had passed days ago, leaving the ground crusted with fresh powder and the air crisp with silence. Morning light filtered gently through the thinning clouds, illuminating the final preparations around the makeshift pen near the ranger station base camp. For Jesse Callahan, it felt like standing at the edge of a memory, one not yet ready to let go. Jesse stood near the gate of the pen, his breath blooming in soft plumes as he watched the trio of Mustangs, now alert and recovering, shift restlessly. The young colt, still thinner than ideal but stronger, paced alongside its older sibling, whose ribs no longer jutted out like they had the day Jesse had found him staggering alone in the snow. The mother mare, majestic and scarred, stood protectively close, her coat brushed clean, her eyes vigilant yet strangely peaceful. Beside Jesse stood Marin Skye, her face partially hidden beneath the high collar of her parka. The wind caught a strand of her auburn hair as she adjusted the transport report on her clipboard. In her late 30s, Marin was a woman of precision and purpose, wiry and tall, with hands always moving, eyes that flicked between tasks with trained intensity. Yet that morning, her movements were gentler, marked by the subtle weight of emotion. Jesse could feel it in her silence. They both knew this moment would be harder than either wanted to admit. The rescue transport vehicle rumbled quietly at the edge of the grove, a specialized truck fitted with insulated compartments for cold weather transport. Two volunteers from Marin's conservation team, Sam and Trina, stood ready. Sam, a tall man with a sun-battered face and quiet demeanor, checked the ramp and the interior blankets. Trina, barely over 5 feet and always humming nervously under her breath, adjusted the hay padding and whispered reassurances to the horses in a voice like wind through pine needles. Jesse approached the youngest Mustang first. The colt turned to him immediately, ears perked, dark eyes locking onto his as though trying to memorize him. Without hesitating, it stepped forward and gently pressed its muzzle into Jesse's gloved hand. Jesse's throat tightened, the coarse warmth of that touch. It was gratitude, recognition, a goodbye too vast for words. "You hang in there, little warrior," Jesse murmured, stroking the soft ridge between its eyes. "The wild is waiting." The mare followed her colt, stepping lightly, but with an unshakable grace. She paused beside Jesse and lifted her head to look directly at him. Her breath steamed against the air, and she leaned close, so close her cheek brushed the sleeve of his coat. Jesse didn't move. He stood still and received her silent farewell with the same reverence he'd once given to a fallen comrade. The older Mustang was last. Once frail and shivering, he now walked with a recovering strength, though one leg still favored caution. He didn't step forward immediately. Instead, he stood at the gate for a long moment, eyes fixed on Jesse. Then, slowly, deliberately, he dipped his head once before following the others up the ramp. Marin oversaw the process quietly, her voice steady but low as she issued instructions to Sam and Trina. Once the doors were closed and the locks secured, she turned to Jesse, her clipboard now resting loosely at her side. "They'll be safe," she said softly. "We'll continue their rehabilitation at the center, and once they're cleared by the vet, we'll begin the reintegration process. I promise, we'll find their herd." Jesse nodded, his jaw tight. "You'll keep me updated?" Marin smiled, tired but sincere. Weekly reports, photos, everything. He watched the transport back away down the snow-laden trail until it disappeared into the trees. Only then did he let his breath fall in a long, aching sigh. 1 week passed. In the quiet of his cabin, Jesse lived his old routines again, splitting wood, boiling coffee, checking the radio. But something had shifted. The silence no longer felt so heavy. There was a lightness in his steps, a rhythm he hadn't known he'd missed. Then, one morning, a ranger courier delivered a small parcel wrapped in waxed paper. Inside was a letter from Marin, accompanied by several photographs. Jesse spread the images across his kitchen table, heart thudding. There they were, his wild trio. The younger horse stood solid on all four legs, no more bandages, coat gleaming under the sun. The mare trotted confidently behind a wooden fence. And the older colt, once so frail, now glistened with health, his mane no longer tangled but brushed smooth, eyes bright with life. Jesse sat back in his chair, unable to speak for a moment. Marin's letter spoke of the Mustangs' death, progress, nutrition improvements, careful social reintroduction, even signs of forming bonds with another small herd nearby. She ended with an invitation. "In 2 weeks, we plan to return them to the range," she wrote. "They'll be free again. If you can come, I think they'd remember you. I know I would like you to be there." Jesse folded the letter carefully and slid into the inner pocket of his coat. That afternoon, he stepped outside, whiskey padding at his heels. The old dog had grown quieter in recent years, but today his tail wagged slowly as he followed Jesse to the old broken fence line where the Mustangs had once appeared through the storm. Jesse rested one hand on the post and looked out at the horizon. Snow still blanketed the hills, but a distant line of dark earth peeked through where the wind had scraped it bare. A sign of spring, a sign of returning. "I guess we both got rescued," Jesse said quietly. Whiskey leaned against his leg, resting his muzzle on Jesse's boot like he had so many nights before. Jesse's eyes softened. "We're not alone anymore, are we, boy?" The wind moved softly through the trees, no longer howling but singing. The world felt bigger now. Not because it had changed, but because Jesse had opened the door. Sometimes miracles arrive not as thunder or lightning, but quietly, in the shape of a wounded horse, a stranger's kindness, or a spark of warmth in the coldest winter. Jesse didn't know he was being saved the moment he opened his gate to the snow. And yet, in choosing compassion over fear, in choosing to care for the broken and lost, he found healing for himself. Just like Jesse, we often carry old scars, wounds the world doesn't see. But every act of love, every moment we open our hearts to others, becomes a doorway for grace to enter. Perhaps this story is a gentle reminder that God's miracles are already around us, in animals who trust, in people who help, in the quiet courage to begin again. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Comment Amen if you believe that kindness and faith still matter in this world. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories of redemption, love, and the miracles we often overlook. And above all, may God bless you with warmth in your hardest winters and guide you to your own quiet miracles.